Good afternoon. I'm Michael Lind. I'm the Policy Director of the Economic Growth Program at the New America Foundation. And I'm pleased to welcome you to today's forum with Dr. Peter Morici discussing U.S. China trade, a subject that's of particular importance for a number of reasons. For one thing, the Sino-American relationship has grown in such significance that some people even speak of a G2, these being the world's largest economy and what may soon be the world's second largest economy. And their interaction with each other, as well as their own development, may shape the world economy in the 21st century. But in addition, there's a growing acknowledgement by experts across the spectrum, from Martin Feldstein on the right to Paul Krugman on the left, Martin Wolf in the center, that underlying the present financial crisis is a long-term macroeconomic imbalance of trade between the chronic surplus countries, of which China is the most important, but Japan and Germany are also significant, and the United States, which has been acting as the market, not of last resort, but of first resort, particularly for China, but for a number of export-oriented economies in the world. To help us discuss this, we have Dr. Peter Morici. He's professor of international business at the University of Maryland and the former director of economics at the U.S. International Trade Commission. Before joining the University of Maryland, Dr. Morici served as the director of economics, as I say, at the International Trade Commission. He's the author of 18 books and monographs, including The Trade Deficit, Where Does It Come From?, and Reassessing American Competitiveness. He's published widely in foreign policy, international economy, Asian Wall Street Journal, Harvard Business Review, and other journals. And you may have seen him on television, as he is frequently featured as a guest on CBS, Fox, CNN, CNBC, MSNBC, the BBC, and the National Public Radio and Broadcasting Network. Dr. Peter Morici.
First of all, let me say thanks to the New America Foundation for the use of their lectern for today, and how much I've been impressed by their progress. So I guess it's been about 10 years now, right? About 10 years in bringing significant thinkers to Washington and making their work more readily available and dispersed than the work that they sponsor. I think it's fair to say that we are in a 100-year storm. We're in the third 100-year period of U.S. history, and this is the third largest economic crisis in our history. We're all familiar with the Great Depression. Perhaps many of you are not aware that before we had the Great Depression in 1929, we used to refer to the Great Depression. And that was a period that began in 1873. We had a recession that began in 1873, which lasted 65 months. The economy recovered briefly, and then it went through a very long period in which didn't end until the beginning of the 20th century, where the economy contracted many, many months. It expanded some, contracted others, but there were a series of cycles, and the U.S. economy did not really accomplish robust growth despite the rather remarkable industrialization that was taking place and transformations which look very much like the technological changes we are experiencing were going on. It was not an easy period to be in. It was characterized by banking crises and was also characterized by currency difficulties. That was the era of Williams Jennings Bryan and the debate over the bimetallic standard and so forth, and deflation and what have you. The Great Recession, the period that we are now in, the longest post-World War II contraction, really has two origins, two sets of origins. And it's very much almost a perfect storm. First of all, and I do have a whole thing about this, but I'm not going to devote or bore you with it today. We had the breakdown in the financial sector, which basically was a breakdown in prudent lending, disciplines in lending processes, and a breakdown in the sound management of securitization. Securitization is the process whereby you go to a bank in Topeka and borrow money from the bank. The bank doesn't have enough money, either from deposits, nor does it have the capacity to hold loans for a very long time, because it basically borrows short and lends long. It takes deposits. Those rates can vary. It gives you a 30-year loan. There's a certain interest rate risk. So you borrow money from a bank in Topeka or Alexandria or Sacramento, and that bank turns around and sells it to a bank in New York, who then bundles it with other loans into a bond or a security and sells it to a fixed income investor. That is the model of banking we have evolved in since the savings and loan crisis, and it is fundamentally, conceptually, a good and sound method of banking. When we securitize loans in that fashion, they sell them to fixed income investors who can hold them for a long period of time and bear interest rate risk. It doesn't really matter to them whether the capital value of the loan goes up or down, or the bond goes up and down with interest rates, because they're going to hold it to maturity. They sell it to insurance companies, which have very predictable payout periods. And they sell it to folks that really don't care how much interest they're getting at all, like the People's Bank of China or the Saudi Royals, whoever around the world happens to hold dollars and wants to park them long term. And therein is the connection to the trade deficit. The second thing that caused this mess was that a great deal of money was made available to capital markets from the trade deficit. Let me explain. Over the last 15 or 20 years, we have been developing what could be characterized as a structural trade deficit. It gets bigger when the economy is growing rapidly, and it gets smaller as it's doing now, or it has done till now, when the economy is contracting. Over the last, say, 14, 15 years, the trade deficit, though, has gone from 1.3% of GDP during a good year to upwards of more than 5% of GDP in a good year. So that the trade deficit in 1995 was 1.3% of GDP and $94 billion. And in the period from 2004 to 2008, it was 5.3% of GDP, or about $700 billion a year. So it grew by a factor of about, what's 9 into 7? And we need an economist around. About 8. 8 times 9 is 72. Isn't that right? Yeah. Okay, good. It's computers. You see, our kids can't add, subtract, multiply, or divide for two reasons. They have hand calculators, and neither can their parents. If you look at where the deficit is, it's not hard to find. This is not a great mystery. Oil imports have gone from 34 billion to 266 billion during that period. Oil imports have gone from 34 billion to 386 billion during that period. And the deficit with China has gone from 34 billion to 266 billion. So virtually the entire increase has been oil in China. Not much has changed on the car front. We have a net deficit of automobiles with the Japanese and Koreans, but it hasn't changed a lot. So depending on the year, the deficit on oil and with China will be somewhere between 85% and 110% of the deficit. Essentially, the trade deficit is oil in China. In oil, it has to do with two things. We haven't done much to conserve how much oil we use in the United States on a net basis. We use oil in industry much more efficiently than we once did. Despite what people on the left might tell you, that goes in the environmental movement, industrial uses of fossil fuels have been highly incentivized by rising prices to use fossil fuels much more efficiently. So steel mills and DuPont Chemical and what have you use natural gas and fossil fuels like petroleum much more efficiently, either directly or when it's transformed into electricity. Higher prices actually do work in industry quite well. The real problem is the automobile. In the United States, we use about, in rough terms, 20 million barrels a day. 13 million barrels a day of that are imported, and 9 million barrels a day is for gasoline. So the trade deficit really comes down to what you drove to work today. It's that simple. And if you look at what's been going on with the automobile over the last 25 years, if we have had remarkable progress in the automobile, very much akin to the remarkable progress you've had in your desktop computer. Your car is a technological marvel. If you went out and bought, say 20 years ago, a Lexus entry luxury vehicle, essentially a mid-sized car that was really the top of the line, an ES300, you'd have got 160 to 180 horsepower. Today you get about 340 horsepower. Why is the car use the same amount of gasoline as it always did? It's because we've taken it all out in horsepower. And we've gone from getting 4-speed automatics in those things to 6-speed automatics. Now, that's been made possible not because what goes on inside the cylinders, that some sort of alchemy has taken place and some chemist has figured out how to make gasoline explode better. But having worked on cars as a kid, I can tell you that the basic process of internal combustion has been dramatically improved by electronic controls. There are no more vacuums and timing belts that are quite the same. You don't have to tune the suckers up every 12,000 miles because they essentially automatically tune themselves up. If you take a 1956 Chevy and we take it outside and we perfectly tune it, we can keep it from polluting very much. The trouble is it falls out of tune as soon as you drive it around the block. A Chevy Malibu today tunes itself because it reads what's going on, what's coming out the exhaust, and it talks to itself. All those sensors, all that electronics. We, quite frankly, could do a great deal to reduce our consumption of oil by simply going back to 160 to 180 horsepower. Heck, you can buy a Corolla today. Probably it's got 140 horsepower. Whereas if you go back 20, 25 years ago, it had 80. And with a 6-speed automatic, you're going to be very happy with it. So we don't necessarily need to have electric vehicles to do something about gasoline consumption. But you probably, if you got the vehicle fleet right in the United States, you could get your gasoline consumption from 9 million barrels a day to 5. It still leaves you with a pretty large trade deficit on oil. The rest of it you're going to have to get, as I say, you got to do all the things the environmentalists want you to do and all the things they don't want you to do. To get rid of the rest of the imported oil, you're simply going to have to drill. There's plenty of oil and natural gas in the United States, but you're going to have to go drilling. That would get the trade deficit, the oil deficit down. And it's really a necessity because we no longer drive the global price of gasoline. Over in China, they subsidize the gasoline consumption. The price of gas doesn't move very much. They use some of the dollars from their massive trade surplus with the United States to essentially subsidize their refineries. They tell them what price to sell at. They sell at that price. At the end of the year, they clean out the deficit by giving them a check. So as China grows, over there, it's happy days over there. Remember when gasoline was not an issue? That's the way it is in China. They're consuming gasoline as if it's the 1960s. And they're going to have real problems because of that. But one of the things it does is creates a problem for us. We're likely looking at oil more than $100 a barrel once the global economy recovers. It could easily go up to $150 or $200 a barrel. At those levels, we're talking about a $500 billion a year trade deficit just on oil. And we can't afford that. Now, with regard to the trade deficit with China, China essentially has been pursuing an export-led development model very similar to what the Japanese pursued in the 70s and 80s. But China is a huge place. To give you an idea, if you go check OECD statistics, how big is China? There are maybe 80 million industrial jobs in the OECD countries, Western Europe, North America, Mexico, and Japan, South Korea, New Zealand, Australia, which you think of as the industrialized world plus South Korea and Mexico because we let them in the club. China has more than 100 million people living in rural areas who, if removed from the farm, would likely make agricultural output go up, not down. So essentially the Chinese, at 20 cents an hour, or whatever it is they pay, can replace every worker in every mine and factory in the West and still have workers left over. Japan never had the capacity to do that. What's more, Japan being a more advanced society wasn't going to pay the kinds of wages necessary to do that. However, that doesn't mean that everything should be manufactured in China. On the basis of comparative advantage, we should expect that as trade grows with China, they enter the WTO, a couple of things would happen. One is that their exports would grow, and we would import more, but also their appetite for things that they don't know how to make would grow. Okay? Can you name a Chinese car that's sold in the West? No. The Chinese don't make a car that meets Western standards. Chrysler just went Dutch before the bankruptcy trying to find a car, the new owners, that they could sell here. The Chinese really don't know how to make automobiles yet. Yet, the Chinese make all the automobiles they need, more or less, other than the high-end stuff, the BMWs. Why is that? Well, they simply won't let us export what we do well there. So we have a problem of trade barriers, 25% tariffs, lots of regulation. And by the way, when you want to make a car in China, you not only have to sell a car in China, you don't have to make it there, but you have to get into a joint venture where, a Chinese company owns 51%. So basically, they're learning how to make what we know how to make better on the basis of foreign trade barriers, foreign investment restrictions. But the most significant thing the Chinese do is maintain an undervalued currency. They fixed the value of their currency back in 1995 at 8.28 to a dollar and kept it there until July 05. From July 05, they let it drift down to 6.83 until July 08, and it hasn't changed since then. To maintain an undervalued currency, what they do every month, every week, every day if necessary, is print yuan, which is really just, as Bernd Bernanke told you on TV, just a little stroke of the computer these days, to buy dollars. And that keeps the value of the yuan from rising, because we would expect with their large trade surplus for the value of their currency to rise. And also, China's modernizing, so their productivity is growing much more rapidly than ours. In a normal year, if we were in equilibrium, which we're not, in a normal year, China grows at 10% a year. It has a 1% labor force growth rate, which means that its productivity is growing at about 9% a year in terms of what comes in from the countryside and all that business. In the United States, in a normal year, if we had 3.5% growth, 2 to 2.5% is that's productivity. The other 1 to 1.2%, we have precise measurement here, is labor force growth. That's the natural rate of growth in the U.S. adult population, plus some immigration. So if our productivity growth is 2%, theirs is 9%, if we were in equilibrium, we would expect the currency to appreciate by 7 percentage points a year. So just multiplying 7 by 13, you get up to about 100. So you would have expected by now the value of the Chinese currency from 1995 would have doubled. In round numbers. But it hasn't. Basically, since 1995, it's risen about 20%, 18%, depending on what kind of math you use. It's about that. In order to do this, China has purchased more and more dollars each year until the recession. In 2008, it purchased about $462 billion. $462 billion in U.S. currency. Now, what this does, the oil deficit and the China deficit, is create two things. First of all, a lot of the oil money doesn't come back here in the form of purchases, nor does it go anyplace else, because the Saudis can't spend it fast enough when oil's at $100 a barrel. So they have to park it. Now, their motivations may be different than Beijing's, but they have to park it. And one of the places they park it is in U.S. securities. The Chinese, they have all these dollars, these beautiful pictures of George Washington, or representations on a computer of George Washington. And they have to park them someplace. So they buy U.S. securities. They buy Treasury securities. They buy bank account deposits. They buy collateralized debt obligations, which are basically those loans bundled into bonds. That provides a huge source of capital in the New York bond market, for which there isn't a close eye on what the rate of return is, what the quality of the bonds are. Even, these shrewd investors from the Middle East have bought some great American companies to learn that they weren't so great. After all, a Saudi prince was a major investor in Citigroup before it went into what it is now. So what you've got is two things. One thing is that it creates a lot of the capital for a lot of the borrowing that goes on. The other thing is that because if the trade deficit goes from 1% to 5% of GDP, you would expect the economy to collapse. Simply, if we have a trade deficit that's 5% of GDP, that means that for all the widgets we make and the wheat we grow and whatever it is that we make in the United States, every time we make $1's worth, we pay people $1 to make it. That means that only 95 cents is being spent here on a net basis, which means that 5% of what we make piles up on the shelf. Grain in the silos, cars in Detroit, and so forth. Unless we consume 105% of what we earn. And over the last 4 years of the boom, essentially what we were doing was borrowing against our homes, on our credit cards, auto loans, and so forth to consume 105% of what we produced. Those loans were being bundled into bonds and sold to fixed income investors, which include, Metropolitan Life, they include your pension fund in Indiana, and they include the Saudis and the Kuwaitis and the Chinese and all of those foreign governments or their central banks that have been parking their foreign reserves in dollars, because they don't hold dollars, they hold securities because they want to earn some interest. As a consequence, the trade deficit made the borrowing necessary, but it also made it possible. Going forward, the trade deficit has come down a great deal. The trade deficit is now about 2.6% of GDP, 2.7% of GDP in the last 2 months. Going forward, as the economy recovers, the trade deficit will grow again. And either we get involved in another cycle of borrowing as the stimulus package dissipates, as that spending dissipates, or the government has another stimulus package and we keep running budget deficits of $1 to $2 trillion a year, or the recovery collapses. So we are involved in a development model right now, or a growth model, that is premised on borrowing ever larger amounts from abroad, and essentially means borrowing ever larger amounts from China and oil exporters. That is likely not a sustainable model. And consider that at the depth of the stock market this winter, the U.S. stock market was worth maybe $9 trillion. Our external debt now, of various kinds, is like close to $7 trillion. The next time around, our external debt will be large enough to cash in for every publicly traded company in the United States. China has $2 trillion in foreign reserves. At the rate it accumulates dollars and other reserve currencies, the next time things crash, we could be looking at a situation where China has $5 trillion and the New York Stock Exchange is worth, say, 10, well, all the stock exchanges together. That is a very vulnerable situation. What is more likely to happen is we're going to have much slower growth, a lack of adequate employment, and so forth. Until we resolve the trade deficit, we will not be able to get this economy going on a nice, healthy growth path again. Therefore, it's absolutely essential that we do something. Now, I have written in other times about dealing with the financial crisis. And you've essentially, with regard to oil, we have to have much more fuel-efficient vehicles. With regard to China, we have to figure out some way to get them to permit us to have an exchange rate for the yuan and to the dollar that will approximately balance trade with China. Approximately. It doesn't have to be balanced, but it certainly has to greatly reduce the deficit we have with China. And that's essentially what 3 Treasury Secretaries were trying to convince the Chinese to do during the Bush years. President Obama, when he campaigned in 2008, talked about currency manipulation, as does Senator Schumer and a lot of other senators. Since he's become president, he's forgotten all about that. Ben Bernanke, when he was in China in 2007, labeled China's currency activities as essentially creating an export subsidy. So it's clear protectionism. And Timothy Geithner called it manipulated when he was in the Senate for his confirmation hearings. But now that they're in the saddle, they have seemed to have forgotten that. They seem to have forgotten that. And unless we do something about it, we're just not going to get there from here. Now, to deal with that, we can continue to do what we have been doing, and I'll remind you the definition of insanity is to do the same thing over and over again and expect different results. So continuing to go over and engage the Chinese by pounding the table, or by thanking them for buying the bonds, or by begging them to buy the bonds, or reassuring them that we will always be able to repay our debts, is absurd. We're not going to get any further with China on the basis of asking them to revalue their currency. The Chinese currency has been repegged. It has hardly moved since last July. They buy and sell as many yuan as they need to keep that currency fixed at $6.83 yuan per dollar. Very close to that. The United States could go to the World Trade Organization. It is actually illegal to maintain an undervalued currency for competitive purposes, quote, manipulated currency. However, it's a very broad concept in the GATT. It's never been tested, but no one's ever brought a case, so we don't know how it would play out. Generally speaking, GATT disputes yield resolution when you're bringing a very precise complaint about a very precise policy. A tax on U.S. cigarettes into Thailand that is not levied on Thai cigarettes. That's the kind of thing that gets you a result. So we can do this several times during the Bush administration, I think twice. A private group that's very interested in this issue because it represents import competing industries and those people that depend on them. The China Currency Coalition, I guess it was, petitioned the Bush administration to bring a case in the WTO, and twice the Bush administration said no. Our countervailing duty laws do permit the computation of the subsidy implicit in a manipulated currency, in the computation of subsidies and countervailing duties for injured industries. Until late in the Bush administration, until 2006, it didn't consider that in computing countervailing duties. It took a case in 2006, but in the end it didn't apply it in countervailing duties. Again, we have a bill in Congress sponsored by Senators Bunning and Stabenow and Representatives Ryan and Murphy that would make it more likely that such countervailing duties were applicable. That's something that would help. Finally, for industries that are generally injured by imports. Finally, what we could do is we could sit down with the Chinese and recognize once and for all that China is not a market economy. After all, the company that's buying Hummer is state-owned and it needs state approval to make that purchase. China is not a private economy. It is not a state-directed, Soviet-style, centrally planned economy anymore. It's some kind of hybrid. It isn't a long tradition of capitalism in the sense that we've had lots of hybrid economies. If you go back before fascism, forget about that. You go back before fascism in the 30s in Japan and Germany, they had highly managed economies through industry associations. And in reality, during World War II, so did we. But China is not a market economy as we know one. And we can say, look, the trade deficit's got to go away. Now, either you figure out a way to make it go away, you can maintain whatever currency you like, though that's going to be difficult, or we'll help you do it. And what I would do, essentially, is tax the conversion of yuan into dollars. So if you import a coffee maker, Walmart imports a coffee maker, that when it converts its yuan into dollars, there's a tax. And it needs a certificate when it brings the product into the country to show how it got the coffee maker and would pay that tax. And I would compute that tax by essentially taking the value of China's currency intervention for the last quarter or the last month or the last year divided by the value of its exports. So it would essentially be in China's hands. If it stopped intervening in currency markets or otherwise found a way to balance its trade so it wouldn't have to, then the tax would go away. Now, the net effect of that would be that would raise the price of Chinese imports in the United States. And it would cause 1 or 2 percentage point increase in the price level. One time only. However, it would also mean that the effect of higher prices, that benefit, would go to the U.S. Treasury. If China stopped intervening in currency markets and let the value of its currency rise, the price would still be higher for the coffee maker, but then the Chinese manufacturer would get that money. And so that would benefit that manufacturer. That creates a very nice incentive for the Chinese to do something to correct their own policy. Now, it's been pointed out to me that China can't have a floating currency because of the antiquity of its banking system. That may be. However, you can fix it at 4 just as easily as you can fix it at 6.8. You can fix it at any number you want if you feel you have to have it fixed. It doesn't have to be this high. It's been pointed out to me, well, Peter, remember who our banker is. Because what happens if they don't buy our bonds? The Chinese are not buying U.S. securities out of the goodness of their heart. They're buying U.S. securities because they've accumulated all these dollars from their monthly purchases of dollars to maintain an undervalued currency. They have these dollars on their hands. They're using what dollars they can to serve their purposes around the world by buying, say, resource deposits and investments that the state considers useful to China's industrial development. But it really can't, you got a $4 trillion economy that's intervening at a rate of $400 billion a year. It simply doesn't have enough uses for all those dollars. So if it stops buying U.S. bonds, it's simply going to have dollars on its hands. So instead of pictures of George Washington that pay interest, it'll have pictures of George Washington that don't pay interest. Those dollars will go out of circulation. If China doesn't buy the bonds, the dollars it then holds go out of circulation, which means the Fed can print the same number of dollars and monetize that portion of the debt with the same impact on the money supply. It has a neutral effect on our monetary policy. China only has the leverage we give them. It only has the leverage we give them. So my feeling is the notion that China can set its currency at any level that it likes and we have to accept the consequences of that is absurd. Their behavior is highly mercantilistic, it's protectionist, and I'm a great advocate of free trade. But free trade has to be based on the notion that we open our markets, they open theirs, and that if you have free trade in goods, you have to have free trade in currency or the system won't work. Because clearly what's happening right now is a situation that is not to our benefit. The U.S. economy is so impaired from its trade deficits on oil and with China that it simply cannot grow properly without having wild speculation and credit bubbles and things of that nature. And that simply is not a sustainable future. I would point out that a great deal remains to be done here at home and that it is not simply China's problem. We need to get our banks fixed and we need to get our energy policy corrected. And so it really is a three-leg problem. And we have a president that was focused on fixing the banks and is getting less focused each day. And we have a president who will fix our energy accounts sometime in the first term of the next president and has completely forgotten that trade with China is an issue at all. I'm not a Republican. I want to make it clear before I make this comment. But I was asked by was filming a documentary on the legacy of the baby boom. And, we got into the trade thing, and I said about Democrats, I says the Democratic Party is concerned about the consequences of trade and China 3 months every 4 years. It generally eclipses sometime around November 15th. And we have had a situation where this president has totally let us down on that. So I'd be happy to take your questions.
If you'll just call on people.
Yeah. Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you.
Right here.
Okay. Just announce your name and your affiliation. Sure. My name is Andrew Anderson Sprecher.
Who are you with, sir?
I'm with Stewart & Stewart. It's a law firm in town. I was intrigued by your statement about the trade deficit requiring Americans to spend 105% of what they earn. I'm not sure about which direction the causation goes there, but given that the current account is a function of domestic savings minus investment, do you see the rebalancing coming from an increase in private savings or a reduction in the fiscal deficit, or where do you see the balancing coming from?
Okay. You asked the question somewhat rhetorically because you said that the current account deficit is a function of, they're both outcomes of the system. In economics and in an economy, you have lots of behavior in which forces go in both directions. It is true that in order to have an equilibrium but bigger current account deficit, you have to have a savings deficit. But that doesn't mean that one causes the other because you observe them in the accounts. The question is, what would happen? What would likely happen if we, over say a 3-year period, reduced our trade deficit is we would have rather dramatic income growth because of the nature of the products we would produce. In exporting industries and import competing industries, the value added per employee is more than 50% higher than in other activities in the economy. So people would have much higher wages and incomes. Also, we would likely face somewhat higher long interest rates, which would discourage the kind of borrowing that's been going on. Because when you talk about increasing the savings rate, you're often talking about not getting people who are already saving to save more, but getting people who are borrowing to borrow less. Because in reality, there are savers and there are borrowers in the United States. Right now, we have more borrowers than we have savers. Okay? Higher rates would cause savers to maybe save a little more, but higher rates would really have an impact on borrowers. You know, and so that's how you'd get that kind of rebalancing. One of the things to remember is that Chinese intervention, or anyone's intervention in the dollar, from a macroeconomic view, in the basic model of macroeconomics that economists study as graduate students in international finance, a $1 purchase is the equivalent of a $1 tax increase by the U.S. federal government. It has the same effect on the model. So basically, you would have incentives within the system which would cause Americans to borrow less. You'd give them more income, which would encourage them to save more, and it would start to balance itself out that way. So there would be a correction. But it isn't like you decide not to save any money and to borrow money for a house, and then miraculously the trade deficit goes up. Yeah, sir.
Yes, Dave Fitzgerald, retired State Department, now private consultant. I have a question about the Japan-U.S. experience in yen-dollar, going from the old fixed rates to what it's now. We seem to have the same sort of trade deficit with Japan. I was wondering whether we have any record of success in this effort to use or to put an end to currency manipulation and to resolve the trade deficit, or whether we really have this sort of structural trade deficit that you mentioned as a part of our economy all the time.
Well, if you look at the data, first of all, whether we have it all the time, it's never been this big. It's been growing over the last 25, 30 years. It initially began with Chinese intervention, but it was never at this level. And we have not been much successful in getting China to end its intervention because essentially what China has done is, create surrogates. It's encouraged the private sector through its interest rate policies to do the intervening for it. They buy huge amounts of dollars. And even now, you can expect, if you read the fine print in my paper, I said that, that we should tax it at the rate of official and surrogate intervention. So we haven't had a lot of success with Japan. And there have been times when official intervention has ended, but with the carry trade and Japan's virtually zero interest rates, the private sector has done it for it. And the Chinese see this, and so they behave as they do. We never really did take steps on the U.S. side to offset as a matter of public policy what the Japanese did. And what I'm suggesting is that if we're going to have the reserve currency, so we have no one to peg against, that the only way we can deal with this is to tax currency transactions when they're manipulated. Yes, sir.
Hi, Alexei Monserrat with the Atlantic Council. Picking up on the question about taxing, I had a question about what kind of administrative barriers that throws up for U.S. business and who pays that, because while a certain amount goes to the Treasury, in a way they end up taxing our own domestic industries, it would seem to me, if they have to manage that process. My other question is...
Well, I want to take them one at a time, because I have a short memory. We'll leave you with the microphone. How's that? Okay? Okay? Yeah. He'll turn it back on for you also, I promise. But you have to promise not to throw it at me. Basically, when you import stuff, you bring it through a customs house, even if the tariff is zero, to establish that it's zero. So at that point, you'd have to establish. The U.S. industries that would be affected would essentially be the importing industries and importers like Walmart and so forth. Okay, so I don't think this would be a terrible administrative barrier. You basically collect it at the point where there are tariffs. It would create difficulties for American companies operating in China, and this is one of my theories as to why this never gets done. Because after all, China usually has a choice, a European versus an American choice about who it does business with. So while we're going through this period of disruption in Chinese-U.S. relations, one of their immediate tactics will be to shift purchases to Airbus. However, I think the Europeans ought to think really long and hard about not playing along with us. Because if the Americans do this and China's behavior is not corrected, China's exports are going to get redirected to Europe because it's the only market big enough to absorb all that stuff. Your next question.
Sorry. Then the next question is, you talked about essentially the lack of Chinese options in doing anything other than buy dollars with their excess. Where do you see the sometimes growing, sometimes shrinking discussion about using the SDR or another form of currency, which the Russians chimed in on yesterday? Where do you see that coming in? Is this just sort of a red herring they're throwing out there that seems to have worked with the administration? But
yeah, it is a red herring. And it's unfortunate that it has worked with the administration, or at least they outwardly suggest that it has. But it is a red herring. It's administratively impossible to come up with a global currency. Suppose that we determined that it would be useful for the Atlantic community, since you're in the Atlantic business, to have a common currency that from Berlin to San Francisco, or Honolulu, excuse me. Could you see the inherent difficulties of creating a managing unit for that, and then that unit managing the money supply, given the difference in the business cycle between Honolulu and Berlin? In order to have a global currency, you'd have to have some entity that did the same thing. Inherently, there's a politics to that. Who's going to manage this thing? This is not going to happen. We're just not going to have a global currency. The SDRs were conceived of that at one point. That really goes back to the days when we were on Bretton Woods, but it's never really matured into that. And it's doubtful in my mind that it ever would. In the back, we got to pay some attention to the back. You have to excuse me, but I can hardly see you from the lights.
Okay, I come forward. Yeah. Chartered Brilliant Correspondent. I would like to talk about something out of the box on both the China side and the U.S. side. China only built up their city, but they totally ignore the rural area. And how about U.S. bring some of their U.S. treasury bond and the technology to help them to build the countryside? Over 60% of population is in the countryside. And if they build up like a city, Chinese market is 4 times U.S. And in this case, they are not just observe their domestic production, also get some U.S. product. And will that be good? On the U.S. side, how to change the mentality of the government and company. The government now is on the deficit spending, and the company is on the debit investment. So how to change these two things, and also, as you say, how to really have a political will to fix the bank. Thank you.
Wow. Well, what would you do if you were Secretary of the Treasury, Peter? That's really the third question. If China were to emphasize rural development, it would go a long way towards creating an environment to solve the problem, because that would redirect Chinese investment towards the needs of rural areas as opposed to consumers in the United States. So that would be a good thing. And there's a great deal that needs to be done in China. You have schoolrooms without heat, you have villages without clean water. All of those things would be very, very useful, and that would be a way for the Chinese to, in addition to sending the United States less stuff, to create markets for U.S. products. I would rather it be based on the Americans sending more to China rather than importing less. This adjustment can happen two ways. In reality, it's going to be some combination of the two. We're going to import less, and we're going to export more to China. The way things are structured right now, if we tax imports, it's likely to be much more on the, or tax currency can be much more on the import side. If China would revalue its currency, it would then have the issue of what to do with its investment dollars. And directing those towards rural areas, towards infrastructure needs in the rural environment would be very useful. Now for China, that creates two challenges that have to be addressed. One is a stronger yuan will create competitiveness difficulties, not just for the export platforms, but for the farmers. And it will mean basically keeping more people in rural areas that might not aspire to stay in rural areas, not by administrative requirement, but just by the market signals that then emanate. And so that will create political problems inside of China. However, I would suggest that those are China's problems to solve. They're not to be solved by deindustrializing Indiana, Ohio, and West Virginia, and all other points west out to Minnesota. With regard to the United States, I agree with you. My view is the stimulus package was way too expensive, that we needed a stimulus package to tide us over, but we could have done it with half as much money and created the same number of jobs that we are going to create. We haven't created 150,000 yet. I've been through the employment data. If they're there, they're invisible. And we're not going to create 600,000 jobs over the next 100 days. If that happens, then I will be playing starting forward for the Detroit Pistons next season. And I'm 60 years old, and I'm 5'6". You get the idea. Actually, American companies are not debt-oriented these days. Some are, but most have been quite prudent about their cash balance sheets over the last 10 years. And they react to where capital is cheapest. So, I think those things are fine. Essentially, the political will to straighten out Wall Street is difficult because of the campaign contribution system we have in the United States. These days, you have to get elected the way Barack Obama was elected. You have to be able to go out there and get lots of people fired up to give you small contributions and to become foot soldiers. And you have to garner lots of $5,000 contributions, which is the individual maximum. Now, that requires basically bundlers, people who can harvest lots of $5,000 contributions. Well, you can't be a bundler all that easily in Topeka, Kansas, because there aren't that many people making $5,000 a year. So you think about it, if I'm making enough money to give you $5,000 per candidate, not $5,000 a year, but you're going to get 2 or 3 contributions out of a person each year. And you're talking about $10,000, $15,000, which means a person has to have $25,000 in gross income to spare, $30,000 in gross income to spare. The only places you can find that many middle-level executives making that kind of money, willing to making those kinds of contributions, are the Silicon Valley, Hollywood, and Wall Street. Wall Street has a disproportionate representation in Washington for a reason. It's an important source of campaign contributions. And slowly but surely, the Obama administration is being reminded that not only were those people on the internet that sent those $1 and $2 important, and that all those foot soldiers from the UAW were important, now they've been paid off, but that Wall Street is very important for financing the Obama political machine. And little by little, piece by piece, all of the things from banking reform and banking cleanup that we thought were good, useful, and necessary are going away. We're not going to have a bad bank. Okay? We're not going to have compensation reform unless the government owns the companies, and I think the government has probably purchased as many companies as it would care to purchase. To give you an idea of the financial acumen at the White House, remember, they brought down lots of very good, bright minds from Wall Street to figure this out. And after 6 weeks, they determined that Chrysler had cars that nobody wanted to buy. The average American could have told them that. But they basically have capitalized General Motors at a level that would require General Motors to reach a market cap or a potential market cap. It's not really going to have a market cap because so many of the shares are owned by the UAW and the government, but that it would be potentially possible to sell the company for $80 billion. At its peak, General Motors had a market cap of $56 billion. And this is a much smaller company now. So at some point in the future, General Motors, after it makes all those wonderful cars that are competitive with Toyotas and that everybody wants to drive and that absolutely conjure up the passions of the 1950s for the open road, it'll be possible to do that. That math is starting to sink in at the White House, and I would suggest they're probably not going to be getting involved in many more companies. So, I think that's probably ended. The next question, yes, sir. Oh, I'm sorry, I told you you had a wait, but this guy's next. You have to use the microphone.
Yes.
So they can hear you in the back.
Derek Scissors Heritage. I have a much narrower question, whether welcome or not. You know the numbers as well as I do. I just want to hear your answer. The July 2005, July 2008, 19% appreciation of the yuan was accompanied by about almost 40% expansion in the size of the rolling 12 months trade deficit. So your emphasis on the exchange rate has a short-term empirical problem, and I'd like to hear your explanation of that apparent empirical blip.
Okay. Over that period, we should have expected, if we were already in equilibrium, for the yuan to increase by more than 20%. Right? The currencies are so far out of whack that we're probably talking, before it's over, of the yuan having to be revalued like 70%. Right now, people say it's around 40% undervalued. I would suggest that likely what would happen would be that the yuan is revalued, and then you saw dramatic improvements in productivity on the export platforms. Because remember, it's a form of protection. So you're not getting all the productivity you can on the export platforms. And that productivity then increases, and the yuan has to be revalued up even further. In my mind, probably the Chinese economy is worth $7 trillion. Now, to say it's gone up 18% and hasn't resolved the problem, that's not the way markets work. I mean, we've seen the price of oil double in a period of 12 months to resolve excess demand. Likewise, there's an excess demand for yuan out there that might require a similar adjustment. Prices have to move more than 18% sometimes in markets. And one of the things to remember, exchange rates are a price. To say the exchange rate doesn't matter, I don't think the Heritage Foundation would say that those textbooks on microeconomics should be thrown out the window. Do you?
No.
All right. Okay. All right. It's a price. It's a price. The exchange rate is a price, and sometimes very wide price adjustments are necessary to clear markets, especially when they've been gradually moving out of equilibrium for 15 or 20 years. It's somewhere north of 50%. It's somewhere north of 50%. And in the initial clearing price will not be the final clearing price, because there's a lot of built up. And by the way, I'm not advocating that the Chinese revalue their currency by 50% tomorrow morning, because I don't want to see the kind of disruption that would cause in China. What's more, you wouldn't be able to get an adequate response in the United States that rapidly. Because remember, a lot of stuff that went away would have to come back. And what's more, you'd want China to have the time to redirect investment. But on the other hand, I do want a firm time path for this to happen. So that, and in the long term, what I'd like to see happen is for China's currency, even if it's going to be managed, to be adjusted to clear foreign exchange markets, even if it's managed, and for trade between the two countries to grow, and for the competitiveness chips to fall where they may among American industries. We export, we import. Some people get hurt, some people benefit, but that's essential in a market economy if you're going to grow and prosper and so forth. It's one of the reasons that I conceived of the contraption I did on the basis of putting it in their hands and making sure it goes away when they stop. The last thing I would want to do is just put in place, say, a big tariff, and then the Congress has to remove it.
We've got time for a couple more questions, maybe some from the back. We haven't bundled We'll bundle 2 or 3, and then we can answer them.
Okay. Thanks, Peter. Charles Bloom, IAS Group. Just to comment on the previous question, in the wake of the Plaza Accord in the 80s, the Deutsche Mark went 55%.
Mm-hmm.
So, and the German economy hardly collapsed thereafter. My question, I want to pick up on your proposal, but take it to a broader question. I mean, if I'm the Chinese and I'm facing a tax as you propose, I think about ways to spend my dollars for assets elsewhere in the world so that you don't come after me. And that could be something the Chinese are actually doing now. They're buying gold, they're buying iron ore, they're buying Lenovo, they're trying to buy all kinds of things everywhere. So if they succeed at that, what happens? All they do is move the dollars to somebody else. I want to look at it from the global macro point of view. The overhang of dollars in the world remains the same. All right? So my question is, forgetting right now about who's holding them, how can we get those dollars back and put them to a productive use, not for paper assets, but to a productive use to try to expand the production capacity of the United States and pay down our massive debt with real output rather than playing endless financial games?
Well, the only way you're going to get dollars back is to have trade surpluses. However, if you were to balance trade, there would be an enormous manufacturing renaissance in the United States. And there'd be a lot more exports of high-tech services like software and so forth. And that would give you the growth you described. The real trick here is to focus on the real side of the economy. So as long as you create the incentives to do things in the United States again, equivalent of, say, 5% of GDP, that 5% is going to be in very productive areas. And so you're going to get it that way. But we're not going to get all those dollars back until we start having current account surpluses to bring them back. There was another question?
I have a question.
Here you go.
You got another question?
No, there are no more in the back, I don't think.
Okay, well, thank you very much for coming.